Hey, everybody. Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to episode 0 for season 3 of the It's Not Scary, It's Just Music podcast. We're in the 2000s, the new millennium. Can you believe it? It feels like we've just been running right through all of this music across these decades so far, and it's just been a total whirlwind, hasn't it? And the 2000s are going to be no different. So, if this is the first episode you're ever listening to of the It's Not Scary, It's Just Music podcast, these episode zeros are usually a way for me to introduce or reintroduce myself to you, as well introduce the podcast and what we do here and a little bit of the history of it. As well, if you're interested in listening to my episode 0 that I did for the first season or the second season, you can listen to both of those too, because I talk a little bit more about my perspective on what I've learned across listening to all this music each time. And my perspective comes from a little bit of a different angle both times. And this episode 0 will be no different. So I would encourage you to go listen to those episode zeros too if you're interested in getting a little bit of background and context before you start listening to the episodes themselves. So to start off with, first of all, I want to thank you for listening. If this is the first time you're listening, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to come listen to me rant about music for about an hour. For those that are returning to the podcast, welcome back. It's been a minute. And if you're listening to this way into the future, it's been almost no time whatsoever. So welcome to season 3. I'm excited for us to get going here. The thing I'll say before I get going too, which I say at the beginning of just about every episode, as well as all of my episode zeros, is all of this stuff that I'm talking about is really just my opinion. I'm not an expert. I don't have degrees in music. I myself am not a music producer, even though maybe I wish I was in a different life. But on the whole, I am not an expert. I've merely listened to an insane amount of music over a very short period of time in conjunction with the project that I'm doing that feeds into this podcast. So just my opinion. Nothing that I'm saying is gospel. It's all very malleable. I'm extremely open to discussion, debate about the perspectives that I hold about all of these albums, what I say about them. I'm not really committed to almost any of that because music is entirely subjective. There can be a little bit of quality, objectivity to it, but for the most part, it's really just creativity manifested externally. So because of that, my opinions and perspectives are my own. You can certainly share in them. You could debate them. It's really free and open because at the end of the day, none of this stuff is scary, right? It's just music and it's entirely subjective. So take my perspectives for what you will. So beyond that, what are we going to be talking about today? First, we're going to be talking about my history with music in the 2000s. Then I'm going to give a brief reminder on this current iteration of the music project that I'm doing that feeds into this podcast. Then I'll talk a little bit more about the rules of the project for the 2000s that I followed. Then I'll talk a little bit about what I've learned so far, which is often the different thing that comes across in all of these different episode zeros. Then I'll just give a little bit of reminder from what I said a minute ago about subjectivity and the complexity of this music. Then we'll talk about why I'm doing this podcast, what you can expect from this podcast, what happens next, and I'll conclude with a thank you for listening again. So let's start by talking about my history with music in the 2000s. So if you had listened to the other episode zeros for the 1980s and the 1990s, you might recall that in the early 80s, my experience with music was just passively receiving it. So the radio would be on, I would be listening to whatever it was that my parents were putting on, whatever was going on environmentally. I wasn't really making a lot of choices about what kind of music I was listening to or what sort of preferences I had in the music. I'd like to believe that my parents had preferences for disco and pop and metal music to a certain extent on my dad's side. So those were the 3 main areas that I think I got exposed to most in the 1980s. As we went into the 90s, I started to have some preferences, mostly in the video game music space. Everyday pop culture music was still something that I was absorbing just because the radio was on. The rest of my family was listening to what was popular on the radio. There was a lot of neo-traditionalist country that was on the radio a lot that I was absorbing. There was some pop music that I was absorbing as well. Obviously, the 90s was a big moment for popular and underground rock music, and so I was passively absorbing it that way. But the only music that I was actively pursuing was really video game music, specifically in the second gen realm. So your Super Nintendo Genesis, like that was mostly the music that I was listening to. And then walking away from the 90s, I was certainly absorbing more popular music as I was getting older and just fitting into the zeitgeist, as it were. So I was aware of boy bands, girl groups, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, all of those artists, like right at the very end of the 90s. And I was also becoming more aware of rap music, R&B music, but at the very surface level. So there wasn't a lot of overt pursuit that I was experiencing on, ooh, I got to go listen to Eminem, or oh, I got to go listen to Biggie and Tupac. That wasn't in my awareness. I was mostly just hearing it, having an opinion, and then moving on. Because even still, as we go into the 2000s, I was still mostly just listening to video game music. Dance Dance Revolution was a really huge opportunity for me around appreciating different kinds of music. Granted, a lot of it was Europop or Euro dance pop, dance music, house music, and trance music, and a little bit of techno. And in that too, a lot of the video game music that was starting to happen on the third gen, so your PlayStation, Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, was starting to go in directions of electronica in many respects. And so the world was starting to merge for me musically, where I was starting to understand how all of these different sounds that I liked were starting to merge together into genres that may or may not have existed at the time. So as we went into the 2000s, it was certainly video game music, but because of things like Dance Dance Revolution or some of the more advanced video game music that was happening at the time. So if I wasn't listening strictly to video game music, I was starting to dabble a little bit in broader electronica, techno house, trance, EDM, and then a lot of Euro dance pop. So that was the very, very beginning of the 2000s. Then in the early 2000s, so maybe a year or two later, idol shows started to become a thing. So there was Pop Idol in the UK, there was American Idol, there was Australian Idol, there was 1,000 million idol shows. And I was totally obsessed with watching them. And so because of that, I got incrementally more exposed to some of the current music that had been happening over the prior 2, 3, 4 years that I was in no way aware of and was completely amazed by. And then at the same time, getting more into standard classics, both on the rock and the pop side. Specifically, I will call out here that in, I want to say 2003, 2004, I got onto Australian Idol, and one of the contestants was really into trip hop, and her name was Chanel Cole. And I had never heard anything like this in my life. It was a little bit of rap, it was a little bit of R&B, it was a little bit of electronica, and it just completely and utterly blew my mind. And so because of that, I just decided I love trip hop. And so I started to go back and listen to things like Portishead, which she actually spotlighted on Australian Idol, which continues to astound me today that they even let her do things that were as out there as trip hop on an Idol show. It just speaks to the quality and the ambition of Australian Idol compared to what was going on in American Idol. I could talk about that forever, and Chanel Cole specifically. But that experience of listening to her do some of that music invited in me these feelings of, maybe I'm missing a whole lot of music that I have absolutely no idea about that I could be reveling in right now. Because frankly, by 2002, 2003, I was really starting to get over video games, generally speaking, and the music quality was really waning for me, which you will see over the course of this podcast too, in the 2000s, as video game music basically evaporates from big lists altogether. So those idol shows really gave something to me that showed me a path towards appreciating music other than video game music for the first time in my entire life up until this point. Like, I'd been alive for 20-ish years, and I hadn't really appreciated anything outside of video game music by choice for the entirety of it. And this was finally that moment for me. So around the age of 20 is when I started to appreciate something else. So at the same time, actually, when I was in college, I had one neighbor that was in our dorms that really liked listening to rap, neo-soul, and R&B music. And he was just listening to music one day, and we were neighbors. And so I just walked into his room and I said, hey, everything that you're listening to, I really, really like it. What is it? And he explained it to me, and he gave me the CD that he was listening to borrow. And I just listened to it endlessly. And it was classic R&B and a little bit of current stuff. It was a compilation disc, right? So it was just a compilation of some of what I understand now to be some of the most popular golden age of R&B songs ever. And I'm sure for him, they were super standard. But for me, it was just mind blowing. Like, wow, listen to these rhythms, listen to these lyrics, listen to these harmonies. They're all amazing. And so they were all new to me. And so because of that, I just really got into that space. And I would say that most of the time when people ask me, what's my favorite genres, I often say rap and R&B, just because they hit me the most out of everything. Like, do I love trip hop? Yes, but because it's a throughput from R&B, really. So in that early moment of the 2000s when I was in college, that was a hugely formative experience for me too, in addition to all of the idol shows that I was watching. So I was really starting to get this crash course education in music. So that essentially progressed over the next 2-3 years, where I started to have conversations with people more so about music and what their experience with enjoying music was. And I often found, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 people in my life, that it was random. It was extremely random, that they would just come upon songs, they'd accumulate them into their little treasure trove of songs that they went back to over and over and over again. Maybe they had a couple, 2, 3, 4 albums that they really came back to over and over again. But for the most part, it seemed like they just came upon this stuff spontaneously. And I sat there and I thought, I've got to figure out a way to really understand music, because this random way that most people seem to approach listening to music and absorbing it does not work for me, because I want to understand context. I want to understand why something's good, where the creation of this sound came from, because it seemed to me that there was always an earlier version of this same sound. And so I wanted to understand that evolution. I wanted to understand the life, the Big Bang, as I said in episode 0. I wanted to hear the origination points, the singularity of some of these sounds that created all of this greatness over the annals of music history. But I had absolutely no idea how to go about doing it until 2008, when I believe I was having a conversation with a colleague about music, and I was joking that I could just go on to Wikipedia and look up every single album that came out in a given year. And I did, because I think the conversation was something around, I really want to understand how the heck we got from 1980s synth pop music, which was at the time what I interpreted to be the entirety of the 1980s experience, which dead wrong at this point. I know that now. I didn't know it back then. And the funny thing was, in like 2006-07, when the 80s were really starting to come back, a lot of people's interpretation of what the 80s sound was mostly just synth pop. So because of that, I was following in that trend similarly, just presuming that that was most of what the music was at the time. So starting there and figuring out how the heck we got from that all the way to Nirvana's Nevermind. Like, how did we go on that journey? And so while we were talking and joking about this idea, I went onto Wikipedia and I looked up and I saw that I could see, at least by Wikipedia's estimation, because it's all generated by group knowledge, all the albums that came out in a given year. And I said, oh, okay. So what if I did something where I could go year by year and listen to every single album that's listed here and just go on the journey to understand how we got from A to B? So that's basically when the first version of this music project journey thing that I've been on started, and that was in about 2008. For the first few years, like 1980, which is where I started, which was totally arbitrary based upon just the conversation that I'd had about going from A to B here, up until I think in 1985, 86, what I was doing was creating these mixtapes for people. So taking what I perceived to be meaningful or impactful songs from that year and arranging them in a way in which it told a story of either the year itself or some just kind of story that I was telling through the lyrics, through the musicality of those songs. So it was wildly inefficient. And like I said, I think I only got to maybe 1985 before I gave up, because at that point in time, going into 86, 87, there were just too many great songs within albums that I just couldn't pick only one, or the genres were starting to spread apart from one another so drastically that it became extremely difficult to create one coherent mixtape that wasn't just total whiplash all the time. And in that, I just gave up and I started to just keep whole albums that really resonated with me, and I gave up on the whole mixtape thing. So by 2009, so the end of this decade, I had basically given up on the first wave of this project, having gotten to about 2006 before I said, you know what, all of this music is starting to kind of bore me a little bit, and I'm getting really tired and burnt out from doing this. I'm going to give up. Also, I feel like I kind of got the gist for how we got from 1980 until the current day, because I missed it by about 3 years. So that's basically what my entire journey in the 2000s was. It was extremely formative as a decade for me in music, to a degree that it kicked off the first iteration of this project. So now let's then talk about the second iteration of this project, which is what I'm in right now and what fuels this podcast. As you might recall from the first or second episode 0, This time around, I started with 1979, which, again, slightly arbitrary, but I perceived that when I was going through the musical experience, that there was a lot of great music that I was missing from great artists in 1979. So having started in 1980, which again, totally arbitrary, I just said to myself, you know what? I'm going to start in 79 this time. And I guarantee you that as I get to the current day, which I will eventually with this project and then the podcast, I'm going to go all the way back to 1950 and carry us back to 1979 again, because I perceive that music in the modern era really kind of started around 1950. I'm probably wrong, and I'm sure that there's stuff that was happening in the 40s and the 30s that is noteworthy that feeds into the modern era of music, generally speaking. But that's the line where I'm eventually going to cut it off so that we can just create the whole cycle from we started in 1950 and went all the way to current day, whatever year that happens to be whenever this is finished. On the whole, still with the second iteration, I'm still going year by year and keeping what I like and tossing out what I don't like. I've got a big list, which used to be just the list that I had before I started doing this podcast. Now it's my big list for every single year. And I've also, as part of this podcast, now have an essential list, which is a select few songs from a maximum of 20 albums that all get fed from my big list every single year. So I've got a big list and I've got an essential list. And as I go through these episodes of the podcast and go all the way to the end, eventually I will have a big list for every single year from 1950 until the current year as soon as it ends, and then an essential list similarly. So that is the goal for this project in its second wave. And on the whole, I would say that beyond my podcast persona that I have here as SJ, in talking through some of this music with all of you, I feel very much like a meteorologist crossed with a sommelier, which I think I had said in the episode 0 of the 1990s too, because I am here to predict weather systems to a certain extent, predict trends that are on the rise, predict trends that are slowing down and going back out to the ocean, and we don't really see them again for a little while until they pop up as a retro movement. And then the sommelier piece, which is, oh, well, if you really like this thing, let me tell you the story about this other band that did these things that were fed off of these sounds and ended up doing this thing that you probably will like too, because they feed from similar pools of inspiration. And that's the person that I consider myself to be as I go along doing this project. And again, it's only because I'm just listening to all this music. I'm not becoming an expert, I don't think. I think I'm just hearing a lot, processing a lot. My range of acceptability for music has widened considerably. My patience for lower quality music, as I would deem it, has also gone down considerably. I know pretty much right off the riff if it's going to be something that I'm going to connect with or not. And more than likely, all of you will connect with or not. I don't necessarily speak for all of you, but I'd like to believe I know at this point or have a pretty good sense of what's going to sound good and what's not going to sound good. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about that as we go along here in this episode 0. But before we get to that, just reminding also on what the rules are for the project, at least for the 2000s, because come the 2010s, the rules are going to change a little bit for reasons that I'll explain here in a second. So typically, where am I looking for my lists? For J-pop and K-pop and Chinese pop and everything like that, all Eastern pop music is coming from Discogs. Didn't pay me. It's just a very helpful, useful resource that All Music doesn't necessarily tap into. And then All Music for basically everything else, because it is a very good barometer. It's a really good gauge. It is a very strong catalog. Again, didn't pay me. And the rating system tends to be pretty spot on, at least for me, where I think I'd mentioned in previous episode 0s, when it comes to the star ratings that they provide, half star all the way up to 5 stars and halves all the way up through it, the volume of albums that they have by star rating does start to diminish over time, especially as we get to like the 2010s. The amount of LPs that have 4.5 or 5 stars starts to go down considerably, which is why the rules change a little bit in the 2010s. But having said that, when it comes to me listening to albums and keeping them, for 5-star albums, I usually keep like 75% plus. I generally keep them. For 4.5 stars, it goes down quite a lot. It goes down to 45%, 40% of those albums that are 4.5 stars I usually keep. 4 stars, it goes down even further than that. We're talking about 5%. And there's a lot more of them too, where there might be 55-star albums, then there will be 150 4.5-star albums, and then like 600 4-star albums. So because of that, it's considerable diminishing returns over time. So because of that, for the 2000s, I often focus on just 4.5 and 5-star albums, again, LPs. And in the 2010s, that does start to shift because the volume of 5 and 4.5-star albums starts to go down considerably. So we had to change things up a little bit in order to make sure that we were getting the full picture, because that's the whole purpose of where we're looking for this music and how we're going about this project. Is I need to understand macro where the music is going. I don't perceive that I'm going to hit every single album of quality or otherwise, because I'm sure stuff is slipping through the cracks on Discogs and AllMusic. I'm absolutely certain of that. Or even on Spotify. Like there's stuff that's just falling through the cracks, and that's just how it's going to be. Even if it's a 5-star album, it happens. And then similarly, if it's not 4.5 or 5 stars on AllMusic, or it doesn't show up on Discogs, I don't even know that it exists really, to a degree that for ultra popular songs where I have to go back when I'm building my big recap list for the decade, I'm finding all of this music that is super popular on Spotify, like it's got billions of listens, that just wasn't on a very quality album by the metrics that I was using. So I have to go back and say, oh yeah, I remember that song. Oh, I guess that was part of the decade. And that's when I pull it back into my recap big list. So I make sure that I'm not missing absolutely everything to an egregious or malicious degree, because I don't want to miss things. It's just there's only so much music that I can possibly listen to, even if I'm listening to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of albums every year. I'm not going to listen to 10,000 albums a year, right? It's not going to happen. So because of that, I try and limit myself to getting the macro picture as much as I possibly can. But does it mean as a result I'm going to miss some trends or mischaracterize some trends or mislabel some trends? Definitely. 100%. Totally own that. And I would encourage you all that if I'm going through, as I've done in the last 2 seasons, and I'm missing a trend, or I've mischaracterized it or misrepresented it somehow or misdefined it, you call that out. You send me messages, you send me hate mail on Instagram, send me DMs where I'm just like, SJ, what the heck is wrong with you? You totally messed this up. Like, that has happened, and I would encourage it to continue to happen, because I'm totally open to all this stuff. It's not scary. It's just an opinion, right? And it's not scary. It's just a project. So if there's pieces of the project that are missing, let me know. I want to add to it, right? Because I think the whole point of all of this is that we're getting a holistic sense of what was going on year by year in the world of music. And so if we're missing stuff, let's throw it in there. Let's not miss it. Let's not skip over it if we don't have to. Unless it's of that lower quality, and then we'll listen to it, we'll entertain it. But for the most part, we'll just say, yeah, that happened. We're going to move on. And then finally, there's not really going to be any video game music for the rest of this podcast, I think. Going into the 2000s here, 2010s, 2020s. Video game music is basically over at this point. We might have an album, 1 or 2 here and there in the 2000s, but by 2006, 2007, it's going to be the rare video game music album that comes up. Rare, ultra rare. And it's only going to become more rare as time goes on, because the whole genre, just as far as quality and ambition is concerned, just totally evaporates. So shouldn't expect much more video game music going forward. How am I cataloging this music? Spotify. Whatever I can't find, I really try hard to, but some of it's just unavailable, and that's just what happens. Be it the artist is a little bit too underground, or the artist has made a very specific choice to not put their music on Spotify. I try to call out everything where I can. Like, for example, if an album isn't on Spotify for whatever reason, but it's a really critical album, I say, go to YouTube or SoundCloud or whatever it is. Go do your best. But that's pretty rare. For the most part, it's all on Spotify. Didn't pay me. Also, this podcast is primarily hosted on Spotify. Didn't pay me. As I said before, I only listen to albums. So LPs, I'm not listening to EPs, I'm not listening to singles, and the likelihood that that is going to have to change once we get further into the 2010s as well as into the 2020s, yeah, the likelihood's pretty high that we're going to have to change that up, because albums just become less of a thing, especially on the J-pop, K-pop side. And as we get even more firmly into the YouTube and social media era of music production and music distribution, LPs become far less of a thing, and it becomes far less of a good barometer for quality of inspiration or creativity from these artists, because they'll just be putting out that one song, or maybe 2 songs, or even 3, but putting out a 8 to 12 track album, less and less and less as time goes on. Also, we don't do live albums or jazz. Live, because if there's a live album, then the possibility that it's getting impacted in some way by the live experience or the audience, we're not doing a 1-for-1 there. So we try to avoid live albums wherever we can. And then we're also not doing any jazz, because jazz is its own universe with its own trends and its own rules by design. So because of that, we tend to just leave jazz on the side, unless it happens to be an album that has jazz in it that is deeply deeply impactful to the overall zeitgeist in the world of music, which has happened from time to time. And if it does happen, we will call it out. As well, limited world music, unless it's generally globally relevant, like the jazz music side. So we tend to limit those as much as we can, because the country or culture traditions music, it tends to just be its own thing. And maybe there's a tiny tweak every like 50 years, but for the most part, it's just honoring the traditions. And so it's not really impacting the zeitgeist of global music on the whole. And if it does, we call it out. Okay, so what have I learned about music so far doing this project? In the 1980s episode 0, so season 1, episode 0, I did an analogy about the Big Bang and how creative ideas in music will start as these singular moments, these singularities that once they explode, they take on a life of their own and they expand and they take different shapes and they merge with other ideas that were also an origination point from the Big Bang and just coalescing into these planets and galaxies and black holes and whatever. And 2, there's also a directionality to it where the sounds, the creativity, the inspiration tends to become more expansive. It gets further and further away from one another, but also has the ability to circle around with one another and merge and combine into these other ideas at the same time. And so it just is this swirl that oftentimes has this origination point that is hard to detect, hard to understand, hard to define, hard to locate, kind of like the Big Bang too, where the likelihood that some of these macro trends like grunge music started with a couple people on a couch messing around, and then it turned into a lyrical run or a riff on a guitar or a drum solo, and then it got turned into a song, and then that song got turned into an album, and then that album got turned into a movement. So that's often how it goes, macro, and it's also why there's often a delay between when the inspiration happens and when it actually turns into a trend, because it just needs time to gestate. That inspiration needs to tap into other people, other artists, so that they can figure out different ways in order to use it and mobilize it and express it. And eventually it starts to hit from a bunch of different angles and it becomes on trend. And then eventually, kind of like an explosion, it eventually dissipates. It starts to wind down, like we've done it a lot, we've done it maybe too much, and then eventually it starts to slide away in favor of other different ideas that evolve off of it, because very rarely do trends in music just disappear completely. They usually go quiet, they minimize, they get enveloped into other genres, and then eventually they do have a moment where they emerge as a retro movement every 18 to 20 years or so. And then it has its retro moment and then it fades away again. And then maybe it comes back one final time before it becomes part of the evergreen of a moment. Like synth pop, for example, it's had its moment to come back in a retro movement and fade away around the 2000s. And so now the idea of synth pop is just quintessentially associated with the 80s for the most part. Similarly, rock and roll or grunge music, like it's had its moment to come in, come out, and now it's just mainstay. Like it's just understood to be part of the tradition of that era of music history, basically. So for the 90s, episode 0, I actually equated it more towards a meteorological storm and storm chasing, where you'll have these music trends that start to kick up like it's just the butterfly effect, right? Like the butterfly flaps its wings and it turns into this little gust of wind that turns into a massive cyclone that starts to whip up the water and change pressure levels, and it starts to create this tropical wave, and then it turns into a depression, and then a tropical storm, and then a hurricane, and then maybe a supermassive hurricane or whatever it is. And then eventually it crashes onto shore, or it just runs out of steam and it just returns to the water. It's in that similar idea. So that's how we talked about it in the 90s. So this time, I'm not going to do any metaphors about the life cycle of a trend or life cycle of music or whatever. I'm actually going to respond to a question that I hear a lot. So people, when I tell them about the podcast, tell them about the music project, tell them about my experience with music generally, which does come up a lot. People ask me, how do I decide what to keep and what to toss? Like, what is good music and bad music to me? It is a feeling. It is definitely a gut feeling. And it being a feeling, it's often difficult to put words to it. I mean, I think that that's the point of creativity, is we're trying to take feelings and turn it into something that we can externalize out of our body, be it paintings, sculptures, cooking, music, philosophy. It's just a way to get the feelings out of our body and put them into something else, someone else, put them out into the universe, whatever. Because the goal with creative pursuits is that we are trying to connect, right? We're trying to connect something that is inside ourselves with something that is inside someone else, or a bunch of someone else's, or just putting it into the universe and saying, hey, I'm here. I'm here and I am reacting to the universe. This is my version of reacting to life, to the universe at large, whatever it is, right? It's this desire to connect to something other than ourselves, potentially something greater than ourselves. And this is the shape it takes. So, not to put such a lofty piece on it, but it's why I generally find it difficult to talk about and explain what my process is, which is a little bit more clearly defined, so I can talk about that. But then the what's good, what's bad, and why. So, first of all, I'll talk a little bit about the evolution of my listening process. So, at the very, very beginning of the first iteration of this music project, I was committing myself, even if it was maddening, to listen to every track on every album end to end without stopping. So I'd listen to the full tracks on the full albums, period. I listened to everything, which was very slow going and it was exhausting. Following that, I started to listen to the full tracks on albums, but I wasn't listening to the whole album. So I would be committing myself to listening to key tracks across the album. So maybe I'd listen to every other track or whatever, just so that I could get a flavor for it before I decided whether or not I wanted to keep it or toss it. So following that, I started to listen to pieces of tracks across the full album. So I would basically say, okay, it's not working for me to listen to only some of the tracks across an album in their entirety. So I'm just going to start listening to snippets of every track on the album. But eventually that didn't work for me either, because I was just thinking, okay, I get the point. I get the point of this. I understand. I get it. Going back to the whole American Idol thing, I started to feel like Simon Cowell a lot, where I was just having these very definitive opinions like, nope, that's garbage, or yep, that's amazing. Move on to you're going to Hollywood or whatever. And I started to feel extremely judgmental about how I was listening to this music, because the perspective I was taking was, who am I to say what's good or not good? I'm not an authority on this stuff. I don't deserve to have an opinion on whether or not something is good or bad and be sitting here judging it so harshly, listening to some album and saying, God, this is just garbage. Not the actual band Garbage, because I love Garbage the band, but this just isn't very good. And I'm sad to say that, because I'm sure that the artist tried really hard, but it's just not very good. And so because of that, I'm not going to keep it. I'm sorry, artist. That similar joke of the sad floor. Like, I'm sorry that I'm stepping on you, floor. Like, it just is what it is. And I am absolutely certain that for a lot of artists, there is a degree of push and pull between having enough fortitude to allow yourself to receive any degree of feedback that is subjective or objective from somebody that's listening to your music. And I get that you have to be strong-willed on that. And that's kind of part of becoming an artist, generally speaking, is being able to take the critiques and the opinions. I get that. But at the same time, I'm sure that they just want to connect. Like, they're creating something that they find to be meaningful so that they can share it with other people, or just put it out into the universe and say, hey, I'm here. And for people to come in and then critique it and say, yeah, that's not very good. You know, you should probably go back to the drawing board on that one. That was not executed very well. That must suck. Right. And so I felt really bad about it for a long time. And it was actually part of why it was difficult for me to endure the first iteration of this project, because I just felt bad not keeping stuff, even though it was for me. Right. Like, these artists won't know me. They'll never know me. Some of these artists that we've interviewed on the podcast, now they know me. But, you know, they've probably forgotten about me at this point, which is fine. And the opinions that I have, fortunately, have been good, because I kept all their albums on the big list, and for some of them, they were some of my favorite albums for that year. So what can one say? But having said that, I would absolutely have no issue whatsoever interviewing people for their albums I didn't put on my big list or my essential list, because at this point I find talking to any artist to be deeply interesting and helps me to better understand the musical experience, the creative experience, the creation experience, all of that. It's very profound. But I digress. So finally, I then moved into just listening to pieces of tracks selectively across the album, which is basically where I'm at now. And in that, I will tell you flat out that I will listen to probably the first 15 seconds, and then I'll skip to about 40 seconds in, listen to another 15, 20, 30 seconds, skip, listen, skip, listen, and then I'll move to the next track, listen, skip, listen, skip, listen, skip, listen, move to the next track. And by then, I probably have a good sense of what's going on with the album and whether or not I'm going to keep it or put it even in the essential list off of my big list. And you might be thinking, SJ, how are you doing that? Like, how is it that you can, first of all, know exactly where to skip in a song in order to understand exactly how to get that barometer of good, bad? off of the track, and maybe even for the album as a whole. Like you're taking a 72-minute album and you're essentializing it down to 15 seconds in one track. How is it that you could possibly get a good barometer from that? And I'll tell you. And usually it's not that. I will even tell you flat out, sometimes I'll go through the entire album listening to little snippets and pieces and still be a little bit undecided on what I think about it or how I feel about it. Like sometimes there's just those 4-star albums that are right on that edge of, I don't know, maybe it's great, or maybe it's good enough to keep on the list, or maybe it's not. I often question as I'm listening to these tracks if my barometer is off, especially if it's been a minute since I listened to music, because I do take breaks. Surprisingly enough, I do take breaks. And I think to myself, especially as I go into a new year, am I missing something? Is my barometer off? Am I not processing the music entirely? Have I lost track of what is of a high quality and what isn't? And the truth, inevitably, every time is that once I get to a really good album, I say, oh, okay, yes, all right, so I have not lost the plot here. I do still know what it is. It's just, it's hard for some of these other albums where it's a little bit unclear if it's good or not, or great or not. I think, honestly, the huge problem that I often have is not whether or not it's good, but the difference between good and great often really slips me up. Usually when something is excellent, which all of these are subjective terms, right? So take it for what you will. The difference between something being great and excellent is usually pretty clear. The difference between good and great is usually what trips me up. Like the difference between, let's just say 4 stars and 4.5 stars, that can be really tough for me. Because again, it's really subjective, the creativity and the artistry. So nitpicking and saying, yeah, okay, I mean, they're doing these things with these instruments, or that lyric was interesting and unexpected, or whatever. Okay, I'll kick it over to the side of great versus good. But I can often do that pretty consistently by just listening to pieces of tracks across all these albums. So when I say I've listened to all of these things, like, yes, I have. I absolutely have. And when I get onto my essentials, I will listen to the whole things just so I get a really good sense of it so I can talk about it thoughtfully in the podcast. But for the most part, I would say overall, I'm listening to more music now than I ever have before because I am giving greater chances to more music because I can slide through it so much more quickly and just process and consume it, have perspective, and then move on. But at the same time, it's a double-edged sword because it means that I'm similarly not investing nearly as much in as many albums. So if people come up to me and they say, give me your 5 best rap albums of all time, I'm like, God, I have no idea. Could not possibly tell you. If I went through my big list, I probably could tease out 5 that I really like a lot. But as far as the best or my favorite, no idea. Couldn't tell you. If it helps, I also feel that way about movies. So couldn't tell you. I don't have go-to things like that. I either like things or I don't like things. That's just kind of how it is. It's how my brain works. So having said all that, now I'll tell you a little bit more about what exactly am I listening for and how can I possibly do it so quickly. Well, when I'm starting an album, right, and I go to track 1, first of all, if you're starting me off with an intro, I'll just skip it immediately because I don't care. I just don't. And I think I've said that before. I said it probably in the first episode 0 for the 1980s. If you start me off with an intro track where you're just talking or it's a skit or something, don't care. I'm just moving on. It's not important to me. They really commit that foul for me a lot in like K-pop. I'll just skip that first track. I'll look at it and go, nope, this isn't anything. I'll just move along. And I think a lot of people do that too, because I'm here for the music. I'm not here for your opinion. I'm not here for this is the album to end all albums. Like, I don't care about that. Just give me the music. So that's first and foremost. When we actually do get to the music though, the first question I ask myself in those first 15 seconds is, are they getting to the point quickly? There can be an intro to the song. And oftentimes if the intro has a long runway to it, if you're getting somewhere, I don't mind that, but you need to be going somewhere is the point. And in an ideal world, they would be getting to that place that they're trying to go quickly. So for example, taking from 2000, Kid A by Radiohead, pretty well-known album. The very first track, Everything in Its Right Place, has a very long lead-in, I think. Some people might think it's not a very long lead-in, but it's a long lead-in. The reason that I perceive it to be good, at least by my estimation, is that it keeps shifting and changing and going somewhere slightly different every few seconds. So it's not just staying with one idea and sitting there and sitting there and sitting there and cycling on it and just reveling in the fact that it exists and somebody figured it out. We get there and then we evolve and then we sit there for a second and then we keep evolving and we keep evolving and we keep going somewhere and it's getting to a point, right? So what I'm listening for when I'm listening to a track is that it is getting to a point quickly, that they're not just sitting on an idea and just cycling on it over and over again. Because once I get the point of it, I'm done with it, right? Like I want to move on to the next thing. Not to say that I'm just an aggressive, vociferous consumer, but like if I understand where you were going with that thing, let's move on, right? Because if I got it as the listener, you got it ages ago when you were still coming up with the idea. Like if you came up with a whole track that was just this one idea, I would question it immediately because I'm like, where's the rest of the idea? This is like 5% of an idea. Where'd the rest of the idea go? So that's often what I listen for when it comes to just getting to the point quickly. Second, is there a clear perspective here? Are we committing to whatever this idea is full force? Or are we doing it in half measures? And another good example of that, taking from the 2000s, would be the album Parachutes by Coldplay that came out in 2000. So Shiver, it has a perspective to it. It's got ideas in there. It's got a point to it. The perspective is really clear. Where they fit in the zeitgeist of music, like I understand where they're pulling inspiration from other artists, and I understand where they're trying to carry the music and the inspiration forward from and to. I get it. There's a clear perspective. They're coming in saying, we're taking some of these ideas and some of this inspiration and some of these concepts, and we're doing this. And it's clear. When you come into albums, which I don't really have any on my big list that I can name offhand from any of these years because I tend to toss them, right? That if the perspective is muddied, if it's unclear, if it's obscured, if it's just not very palpable, it's very thin. Like, for example, if an artist is taking an idea that has already existed in the music world for several years already, it's not necessarily like out of style even just yet or passé, but it sounds like a lot of other things that are happening right now. And it's not bringing anything different, new, interesting, novel to the table. I'll sit there and ask myself, why are they doing this? What is the inspiration and the perspective here? And why can't I understand why they've created this album? I think that that's mostly the question that I'm asking myself. Like, what are we doing here today? Listening to this music, listening to this album, listening to this song, listening to this artist. What are we here to do right now? Even if it is a fairly harsh judgment on if I'm not hearing the reason that we're here and I'm disregarding it, that's pretty harsh, right? And again, I've judged myself considerably on how harsh I'm being in this regard. And I do feel kind of like Simon Cowell, where I'm sitting there and I'm saying, nope, there's no perspective here. Get out, right? That's just what it becomes when you just listen to all this music. At least for me, that's what it became for me over time, where I would just sit there and go, I'm not hearing anything different, interesting, or meaningful here. I'm not hearing anything unique. I'm not hearing anything novel. I don't know why you made this album, basically. Other than the fact that you wanted to create it in order to connect with something or connect with an idea. That's great. That's why all music is created. Not the website, but that's why every single piece of music is created. It's to connect and expel your inspiration and put it out into the universe. But like beyond that, what are we doing here? What are we trying to accomplish here? And if it's not clear what we're trying to accomplish, the perspective isn't clear. So I know that that's a little bit theoretical, but that's approximately what I'm listening for when I'm going in those 15 seconds. Like, what are we even doing here? Have I heard it before so clearly that this seems like a repeat of an idea? And that's to say too, when an album getting to the point quickly thing, if you keep hitting the same idea over and over and over, like if the first track nails it, love that idea, but then the second track does the same idea, I'm starting to question what the perspective is. If it does it a third time, I think I've figured out what the perspective is at that point, which is that there isn't very much of one. We had one great idea and we're trying to carry that one idea across an entire album for reasons that I don't even know what. We could have just come out with a single or an EP, which I wouldn't have listened to as part of this project anyway, but did we have to do a whole album for this? I question that. So similar to those two ideas, does the song go somewhere? Because I talked about Everything in Its Right Place by Radiohead on Kid A, the first track. And when we talk about getting to the point quickly, this is different than that, where you start in the song and where you end is different. It doesn't have to be completely different. Like the idea that you start an idea and then you start another idea and you start another idea and you start another idea, and then all of those ideas end up all within one another by the end. So we've kind of come full circle a little bit. That's a great concept. It often works for me if the perspective is there and we get to the point quickly. But you have to go on a journey with a song. You have to start somewhere and then go to B, C, D. Like you have to end up in a different place than where you started. And what I often find when it comes to music that I deem as, in quote, not good, or stuff that I would toss, is that we just start with one idea and we just keep cycling on it over and over and over again, and we're not really adding anything to it. And this can take the form in any genre, Really, it can be folk music, it can be electronica, it can be rock music, metal, pop, rap, it doesn't matter. As long as you're going somewhere in the song, then we're good. But there's a lot of music out there where the journey is meandering. We go backward a little bit, then we go forward a little bit, kind of going along with, is the perspective clear? It doesn't seem like the artist exactly knows where we're going with a track, which goes back to that question of why are we actually here today? What are we here to do? What are we here to listen for? What am I supposed to be connecting with? And if that experience that I'm supposed to go on doesn't go very much of anywhere, it's not that interesting. I think a really good example of that would be, even for brief music, like the Beatles, for example. Paul McCartney is very good as a songwriter because he often knows how to get to the point quickly. The perspective is often very clear. Even if it's simplistic, it's very clear. And the song usually goes somewhere. Like we add to it, they add more harmonies to it, key change sometimes. Maybe we start in one place, but then the song ends up in a different place. And then it ends quickly, right? Like often, this is, at least to me, why the Beatles in large part succeed musically, is because it hits these things. They get to the point really quickly. The song goes somewhere more often than not, even if it's a very simple song. And they also end it at the right time so that wherever the journey ends, we don't just keep going for another 2 or 3 minutes into the same thing because you already got there, right? So when you get there, you stop. That's the end. That's it. It's also kind of why I like punk music, because they usually get to the point and then they stop when they've gotten to the place that they've gotten to. And then we get to the next song. And also the perspective is often very clear when it comes to punk music. Very rarely is it not clear. So taking those 3 things into account, the 4th thing that I listen to are there any opportunities that are being missed in this track? So if, for example, and I'm not going to give specifics, but like, for example, if you're listening to a song and it's just traveling in this one little space where it goes like +3, -3 in terms of its inflections and where it's going on this journey, like it's just moving along. It's not really going very much of anywhere, in terms of it's got high highs, low lows. It's got big crescendo moments. It's got great harmonies. It's got really low quiet moments. Like it's not particularly dynamic or complex. So when we're talking about does the song go somewhere, is the perspective clear? Does it get to the point quickly? The question that I then also ask myself is, are they missing any opportunities? And more often than not, and not to say in an arrogant way, like I can detect all the things that they should be doing with a song, because I'm not some armchair musicologist that knows everything about everything when it comes to music, but I can hear when there's things that are missing. And this isn't to say that a super quiet song with just some person with a guitar and they're just singing right into the microphone, like super lo-fi, that's going to be a minus for me all the time. Because if you're filling up all the space sonically with your voice, with the strum of the guitar, the lyrics, and it's completely just consuming all the space sonically of the song, you're good. Now, are there opportunities maybe to throw in little tiny extra ideas like an unexpected note or unexpected metaphor or whatever in order to just add a little bit more flavor to it? Yeah, but that's nitpicking. I would say that there's often a very distinctive zone of black and white for me. The gray zone is often very small on this specific thing about whether or not they're missing opportunities. For me, oftentimes, they're either missing opportunities or they're not. And that's just really kind of it. And at that point, it's really then up to me to decide how much I care if they're missing opportunities. Because, for example, Baby One More Time by Britney Spears, are there things that are missing from it? Yeah, definitely. Max Martin, great pop writer, like no shade on him. Are there things sonically that are missing from the song that could be adding extra pieces to it in order to give it an even more complex dynamic? Yeah, but it is a pop song at the end of the day. Having said that though, there's not a lot missing because the bass line is very clear. He adds little artifacts and little pieces into the musicality too in order to keep the song interesting. Britney Spears' voice really fills up the space, even if it is a very kind of thin, tinny sound, which is quintessential Britney Spears' sound in her voice. But there's harmonies in there, it goes on a journey, and it gets to the point very quickly. Every single time it has to get somewhere, it gets there pretty darn quickly, and it goes somewhere. And the perspective is clear, that this is just dance pop music, and it's taking some inspiration from the past. It's very clearly defining the directionality of pop music going forward. And are there opportunities that are missed here and there? Like, yeah, there's a little bit of dead space every once in a while that doesn't need to be there. Like some negative space is really critical to the music journey, but in some cases it's like, yeah, okay, that part for that like 2 or 3 second span right there was a little bit thin, or that 5 second span was thin, or that one beat should have been a little bit richer. Like, yeah, you can nitpick all day long. But when it comes to whether or not the things are missing, it's usually a 1 or 0, like yes or no. And then for me, it's just how much do I care? So that tends to also be very critical when I'm listening to these little snippets of songs. And then finally, and this is like the ether of listening to all of this music, especially as I'm going through this project. And it's really hard for me sometimes to decide how much I care about it, but is it timely? So we talk about the 18 to 20 year rule about retro movements. And it's only because it's based upon my experience listening to this music where I'll be listening to an album in the middle of a trend or leading up to a trend or at the end of a trend, and I will be sitting there going, wow, we have really wrung out the inspiration on this idea. We've been doing this for 5, 6, 7 years already. This is really late to the game, and they're not bringing anything new to the table. Like the perspective isn't there. Even if they get to the point quickly and the song goes somewhere and they're not missing any opportunities, the perspective is the thing that hits you. That's just not right. Like, we've really been sitting on this for a while. What are we here to do exactly? Are we here to just keep playing the same songs over and over and over again, the same ideas over and over again? I thought the point was that we were supposed to be trying to connect with other people through these ideas and through this music and through these songs. Like, this isn't covering other people's stuff. This isn't coming up with new ways to express this idea. So what are we here to do exactly? So that's usually when we're at the very end of a trend, or maybe we're even past it. Like if we're listening to synth pop in 1994, I'm like, ooh, this is really, what are we even doing here? Why is this happening? Why did this album get created? Because it's still too early for it to be a retro movement because it just ended like 3 years ago. And it's way, 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 way too late to the party. So is this an old artist that's trying to recapture new fans? Just trying to put something out to get money? Like, what's happening here? So that's usually the timeliness of when something is getting released at passe. Now, when something is getting released that's new, it's really on the cusp, like avant-garde, basically. And there's a lot of that we've experienced over the course of this podcast so far, and 2000s will be no different, that you're sitting there thinking, wow, this is really out there. Is this cooked enough? Has this idea realized itself enough, and it is clearly enough connected back to earlier things that there's a line of logic to it? Or is this just so wildly experimental that I just can't follow what they're going for here? I can't follow what we're supposed to be doing here today, how we're supposed to feel, what this is supposed to mean. And so the timeliness does feed into the, is the perspective clear? Does the song go somewhere and all that other stuff? The timeliness does fit into it quite a bit because you're sitting there thinking, is this the right time for this? Is this the right moment for this? Has there been enough leading up to this that this makes enough sense? And in some cases, it's so good it doesn't matter. Like you're just starting something new and it just is what it is and we're just going to ride whatever this is. And in those cases, it's like, an album comes out that's totally avant-garde and people won't be processing and understanding what to do with it for years. Bjork is a really good example of that, where she was doing wildly avant-garde stuff in the early 90s that I don't think really started to turn into something meaningful until like the late 90s with the rest of the music world, or early 2000s. And you'll have that where you'll have really excellent albums that come out that are just completely bucking trends, that they're totally avant-garde because they're not really connected to anything in a clear-cut way. And they're just so far out there with the inspiration that it's just difficult to connect the dots. And so is it timely? Is a plus and a minus. Sometimes, no, it's not, and that's great. And sometimes it's, no, it's not, and that's not great. So it really kind of depends on all those other 4 factors that we're talking about here. Is the perspective clear? Did they get to the point? Does the song go somewhere? Is there missing opportunities? If all of those other things are lined up, and is it timely, is also like way, way early, I'll still probably consider keeping it because it's like, I don't know, maybe my window of acceptability is not strong enough. I just can't process it right now, but I'm detecting and understanding that technically everything that's happening here is correct and good and right. But maybe I just don't understand the timeliness of it. And that's what it is. But if it's on the other end where it's late, that's tough. It is tough. I honor sometimes that we'll have 1 or 2 really great albums that come out at the very end of a trend and they're just nailing everything because this trend is just so old hat that like all of the different mistakes and challenges and hiccups have been ironed out by so many artists that coming out and just putting that record out, it shouldn't be particularly challenging. Like rock and roll has been around for a really long time. Coming out with a rock and roll record today versus coming out with one that's new, that basically just taps into the rock and roll ideas of old, versus coming out with a rock and roll record in 1950. The challenges are far different because we've learned a lot about what the shape of rock and roll needs to be in order to effectively articulate the message or the intention or the perspective, right? So it can be difficult. And then two, it really does help as a good barometer for whether or not we're getting into that retro movement. So has it been 14 years, 15 years, 13 years? It's not quite time for me to be done being sick of this idea that has gone quiet for a while and so many other ideas and perspectives have come out that now I'm ready to hear this idea again. That's also a really tough thing to gauge when you're listening and going, wow, this really sounds like, in the 2000s, for example, power pop really, really comes back into its own in like a neo power pop sort of way. So where in the 80s, there was a lot of power pop, there was a lot of blue-eyed soul, there was a lot of, it wasn't called that back then, but in the 2000s, they called it yacht rock, which was also a soul, jazzy sort of thing, like think Hall & Oates, that really comes forward in the 2000s. And so you really have to sit there and listen and go, is this too early? Like, am I ready to hear this yet? Or is this sounding not quite right, timeliness wise? And it's not like I'm sitting there like looking at my watch saying, oh, it's been 17 years, not quite right. It's literally because I listen to this stuff and I go, in my mind and in my heart and my gut, I feel this is right. This is the time for this. Or it just isn't. Like, it just hasn't been enough time. And that window of time is usually about 18 to 20 years. It's just what it is. That's what my gut tells me. Maybe yours is different, but that's what my gut tells me. But you have to take that into account too with, is there a clear perspective? Because if it is timely, so it's been 18 years since yacht rock has been a thing or power pop has been a thing, and the timeliness is there, is the perspective there though? Does this just sound like we're listening to something just almost like one for one match power pop in the 1980s, or is it doing something new and different? That's the question. Like, has it been updated based upon everything we've learned macro within the realm and the space and the universe of music between when it came out the first time and where we're at now, and taking all those things that we've learned and infusing it into those older ideas and turning it into something new in a retro movement? That's the question. Because if they're just saying, we're basically just going to do a straight Hall & Oates copy record in 2007, I'll just sit there and go, why are they doing this? This doesn't make any sense. Like, are you paying homage to Hall & Oates, or are you copying an old sound for the fun of it? What is happening here? And it can be great. Like, it can get to the point quickly. The songs can go somewhere. They're not missing anything. But the perspective and the timeliness start to run into one another and you go, why are they doing this? I don't understand why they're doing this. I'll be listening to it and asking myself that question, like, what is going on here? Why are they trying to basically copy the Police? Why are they trying to copy U2? It doesn't make any sense to me. Are they trying to just capitalize on that sound as if we've never done it before and now we're just doing this whole new thing? Why are they not taking things that we've learned between Joshua Tree 2008 and infusing those things that we've learned and those creative things that we've uncovered in the realm of what sounds great within music across all the genres that have grown up and disappeared between that time? Why aren't we infusing more of those ideas in here to just give it some new flavor in this retro way? And that's that question. Is it timely? So mostly that's what I'm listening for. So finally, of what I've learned so far, why do I keep something or toss it? So among all of these things, why do I end up keeping something or tossing it? So first of all, I'll say that my big lists aren't necessarily just albums that I personally like, nor are they strictly important albums, because I think defining something as important is subjective also. And what I like is almost entirely irrelevant, because I would say that the things that I end up keeping resonated with me in some way. And I like the fact that it resonated with me in some way. But at the end of the day, I often keep something because I can't come up with a good reason to toss it. Kind of an innocent until proven guilty thing. I would rather keep something for reasons of I just couldn't figure out a way to toss it than I needed to keep this album because it's so important. I very rarely did that. Like, I kept Nirvana's Nevermind or, OK Computer by Radiohead because I just couldn't think of a reason to toss it. It was a very easy decision, but I didn't keep them because they were important and I want to have some degree of clout, like, oh yeah, I know things about music, look what I kept. Like, none of that matters to me. It's about me deciding that I just couldn't give something up for whatever reason. And so because of that, you might listen to some of the albums that I have on my big list and go, why did SJ keep this album? It's weird. Or it's not very good, or it doesn't make any sense. And the answer is I just couldn't come up with a reason to toss it. Because the way that I often do these things is I take all this music that I'm gathering from Discogs and from AllMusic and I shove it onto a giant playlist. So what you see as a big list today for every episode that I release is a fraction of what I start with. But I put everything on the list and then I'm taking stuff off. I'm just taking it off. So the reason that it's smaller is because I'm taking stuff off, not because I'm deciding to keep it. Because my decision a long, long time ago was that the only way that I was going to be able to feel good about the music that I was cataloging for myself was the stuff that I decided not to toss versus the stuff I decided to keep. Because I can never tell in moments if I'm not resonating with something but don't want to toss it because of a challenge that I have or because the music just isn't very good. I can't tell sometimes, and so because of that I just commit to keeping it because what's the harm in keeping it? I'd rather keep it than toss it and forget about it forever. So that tends to be my approach. Another reason that I often keep something is it's possible that it's a harbinger for sounds to come. Maybe not. I have no idea sometimes. It often surprises me as we're going through this listening journey which genres pop up and which don't in times that I thought that they were or might have. It's rarely clear where and how a trend will begin, progress, settle, or end. And so because of that, sometimes I just keep albums because I'm like, this sounds like it's really going somewhere, but I'm not totally sure where macro it's going, and I can't really figure out a reason to get rid of it, so it stays on the list. Having said that, I do have go-to albums within every big list, and often they appear on the essential list, but not always. Often I'll like just one or two songs from an album and keep it for that reason. It often goes that way too, where I'll acknowledge the fact that maybe the one or two or even three tracks on an album are solid or even really great, and I'll sit there and go, I just can't think of a reason to get rid of this. But having said that, sometimes an album will just have one song and it's so outside the quality of the rest of the album that I'm really hard pressed to keep it, despite that one great song, because that happens too. And it'll have just this one lightning bolt of inspiration, and maybe they'll just keep doing it until they've just wrung it out and it's unnerving by the end of the album because they just kept sitting on it. Or they came out with just one track and it was like the first track on the album, or maybe it was like the third track or the fourth, which is often where those tracks sit. Very rarely do tracks like that sit in the back half. But there was one track, and it was amazing, and it had all the perspective, it got to the point, it went somewhere, it wasn't missing anything. And so I sit there and go, they nailed this one. What happened to the rest of it? What happened? And so in those moments, I kind of sit there and go, well, I guess I just don't have an inclination to toss it because I can't tell if it's a me thing or a them thing. So I guess I'll keep it because they had this unbelievable lightning bolt of inspiration, and it's hard to deny that. So because of that, I'm hard pressed to find a reason to toss it. So I don't toss it. And then having said that though, too, often I'll keep albums with songs I like because I'm afraid I'll lose track of the album over the course of the project. So I keep it close to me. I mean, that happens a lot too. Like the first time I went through the project, or even the second time I've gone through, where I've made these lists several years ago at this point, and doing the podcast, I revisit them so that I can do the episode, do the essential list and everything like that. And so I get to revisit that album with those tracks on it. So I kind of thank past SJ for remembering to keep that album in there to go, oh yeah, I really like that song, or I really like what they did with that, or these 3 or 4 songs. Because if it weren't for that, I would completely lose track of some of this stuff. Like it would just be one of those name that tune sort of things where I'm thinking about a song or a riff and I'm like, God, what was that song? And for somebody such as myself who's listened to, I don't know, 100,000, 200,000, however many, hundreds of thousands of songs, it's really easy for me to lose track of a track or a riff or an idea or whatever, and unfortunately conflate it with several other ideas at the same time, and it just gets to be a big jumbled mess, and I'll never find that thing ever again. So I try to help my future self out. So having said that all, my big list for every year and the essential list are still biased, though, right? As I said before, based upon the view I have of what's defined as quality music from AllMusic, right? So if they don't define it as quality and as an LP, then I'm gonna miss it. And I think I've said that before, that that's just how it is. That there's plenty of stuff out there that will totally fall through the cracks by either how it was defined, how it was rated, whatever. I just won't see it. It happens all the time. I've thought oftentimes about going back and doing like a retroactive cleanup eventually, maybe in the future. But for now, I generally think that getting the macro view that's like directionally correct in its moments is most important to me. And the reason for that is, despite the fact that I'm still missing things, and I absolutely know that about myself, I'm not going to let perfection paralysis run the show here, because I think that creativity is just an infinite resource, and being able to figure out where things are going is mostly all I can possibly do with any degree of certainty and feel good about it. Because I've often said when people ask me, why are you doing this project? It's because it's the only way that I could imagine doing this. I couldn't think of a different way to do it, so this is how I'm doing it. So having said that, I'm just going to cycle back on the idea that all of this stuff is an opinion for me. My understanding and acceptance of newness has and continues to evolve. My window of acceptability with music has widened considerably over time, even going through this podcast and re-listening to some of the stuff that I cataloged years ago at this point. It continues to grow and evolve. So what I liked in 2008 when I was listening to 1984 the first time is vastly different than what I consider to be great today. And it'll continue to go in that direction. So because of that, again, I defer to tossing things out when it's just like so clear cut that has no place in the big list, because I just don't know if it's me or if it's the music. I just don't know. And so because of that, I always defer to tossing versus selecting what I keep. Like I already know I'm missing a lot. It's so I don't miss even more. And in that, I also rely on all of you to be coming and telling me when I've missed something, because I say at the end of every episode, what did I miss? I missed a lot of stuff. I always miss a lot of stuff. You help keep me honest and keep me moving forward and keeping that view wide for me so that I'm not missing anything, so that if we do hit some weird avant-garde hiccup, or at least in my mind it is, because I've missed a whole macro trend that was leading up to this moment and I just wasn't hearing it for whatever reason, I gotta find out about that stuff. So that's why it's always really important for you all to come tell me when I've missed something. That's why it's important. So just giving a little bit of a refresh here as we get towards the end here of this episode 0. So reminding why I'm doing this podcast. So I think I've said at length here, this is based upon a music project, that this was really the only way that I could determine how to listen to music in a way that was satisfying for me. But the reason that I'm doing this podcast is to really help organize this experience that I had listening to all this music and give it some directionality, give it some structure, give it some perspective, perhaps, right? If we're talking about the creative experience, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily getting to the point quickly always. I'd like to believe that my perspective is fairly clear or reasonably clear, and that this does go somewhere, right? If we're comparing what I say about music to this. Am I missing opportunities? Yeah, it's why I say, what have I missed? And the timeliness of it, well, we're always time travelers on this show for the most part, so we're always behind in some regard. But that's half the fun, isn't it? But the point too, beyond organizing my experience, is that I want to share in this journey and what I've found with other people. I do it with my friends and family and the people that are local to me that listen to the podcast. They want to talk to me about what they thought about the music or think about music today, and they want to hear what I have to say about it, and we can go back and forth into discourse and everything. And all of that happens because I've started the conversation here. So because of that, I'm just sharing this journey that I'm going on and just what I've learned and what I've found. Like that whole thing I just ran through about what have I learned so far. It's me sharing with you what I've learned listening to all this music. Whether or not it helps you is debatable. But at the very least, it helps get these thoughts and feelings out of just me and into other people so that maybe they can share this, maybe they connect with it, maybe it means something to them, maybe it helps orient them in their own music journey, who can say? But that's the point of this, is I'm not necessarily out here doing this for a specific reason other than to just share this music with people, share my journey with people, share what I've figured out along the way to help maybe them with their music journey, and to just connect with more people, frankly. I mean, because I love connecting, so the idea of connecting and sharing music with other people is really wonderful to me. And so that's another huge reason why I do this podcast. And it generates meaningful discussion and debate, like a lot of it, like a ton of it. I know a lot of people that listen to this podcast that have very passionate debates about the essentials that I put on there, the tracks that I picked from the essentials, my conspicuous absences or the lack thereof, some of these genres, what I've missed, what I didn't miss, all sorts of stuff. So it generates discussion and debate. I love that. I always wish people would discuss and debate with me more about this stuff because it already happens a lot. I'd love to do it more. It's one of my favorite things to do when it comes to music, is to just share in this stuff and revel in it and talk more about what it means or what it doesn't mean or what's important or what isn't important, just all that stuff. It's great. So as far as what comes next, for those that haven't listened to this podcast before, I'm going to go year by year. So starting with 2000. So after this episode, we'll jump into the 2000 episode, in which I will talk through what's happening in the world of music trend-wise, so genre-wise, for that particular year. Then we'll get into my essential albums for the year and why. So the albums off of my big list that I decided were the most impactful, the most meaningful, the most significant off of my big list, and then why. And I'll give a few examples from those albums to elicit the point on what the significance of this album is and getting a flavor for it. And then my conspicuous absences, from this year and why. So albums in which they were either widely popular, widely famous, they're considered to be a high watermark for a given year, but I decided to not put them on my essential list for whatever reason and why, and then just close out. And we'll go 2000, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up until 2009, and then we'll have a recap of all of the 2000s as I've done for the prior season. So it's like a season finale, basically, where I go through the entire decade, genre by genre, talking with specific example songs, what the evolution of particular genres were across the entire decade. As far as what you can expect from me from this podcast, it's about this, I would say. Analytical, funny, maybe. I don't know. Really depends. Passionate. I tend to be pretty passionate about specific subjects, specific albums, specific genres, specific moments. You could expect that from me. I tend to be pretty authentic and upfront and honest when it comes to how I present myself, so you shouldn't expect anything substantively different here than what you're experiencing in the episodes themselves. But having said that, where do we go from here right now? Go listen to 2000 or go back and listen to the episode zeros from the 1980s season and from the 1990s season before you get going. Do whatever you'd like. Let's just go. Let's make it happen. So make sure that you join us again. Start with 2000 if you'd like, or go back and listen to earlier seasons if you'd like. It's really up to you. Make sure that you check out my big lists and my essential lists from all of the episodes that we've had up until this moment. They're all on Spotify, and they're also linked in the description of all the episodes that I release. I often release every other week, so make sure that you're looking out for that. Make sure that you're following us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod, because we'll be reminding you about all the episodes that we're releasing leading up to them. And make sure that you enjoy, because the whole point of all of this, as we've often said, is that to engage with all of this music meaningfully, you really need to widen your aperture and open up to the possibility that there's some bit of music out there, some genre, some era that maybe you thought you understood better than you do. And the only way to really fill in all those little bits and pieces and make sure that you're not missing anything is to realize that some of the stuff maybe you were afraid of in the past for whatever reason. It either sounded actually scary, or it was of a genre that just didn't hit you in the right way, or you felt that by listening to or appreciating or enjoying this music, you were going to be defined in a specific way or judged somehow. That in this moment right here, in this space that we've got for ourselves in this podcast, it's not scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening, everybody.